Well, we thank everyone for being with us today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be here with us, for taking the time to nurture your soul, for your spiritual growth. And when this topic came to me, it came in different ways. It kind of kept the theme kept arriving. We sometimes there's a theme that just keeps popping up during the week, and it raises its head in different ways, and it's kind of like a clue for me. Maybe this is something we need to talk about this week. Maybe this is something to explore. So the idea of the sin of unconsciousness, we're going to talk about that a little bit, but the idea came from a chapter in one of Osho's books, and the title of the chapter is Beyond the Sin of Unconsciousnness. I had to truncate a little bit. I had to shorten it to make it fit everything. We call it the Sin of Unconsciousness. And at first it seemed to be something that was going to be straightforward. We as human beings in our human world, in what some of the teachers would call the carnal mind, the human mind, we live most of our life at a level of unconsciousness. Things happen automatically. Things happen based on our past experiences, our past opinions, our past judgments. We're kind of like programmed to react and respond. But that's the human experience. And the spiritual experience is an experience of awareness. It is not an experience of rote or unconsciousness. It is an experience of awareness. And if we wish to grow spiritually, well, we must bring ourselves into a greater experience of awareness. We must move beyond the sin or the mistake of unconsciousness. But the more I got into it, then we start to get into, well, what is this thing called consciousness, And what we tend to associate consciousness with in our society is, first of all, awareness. We recognize that there are things that happen that we are aware of, and there are things that happen that we are not aware of in our own mind. For example, we go to sleep at night and we dream, but we're not always aware in the morning of what we have dreamt. And yet while we are dreaming, there's a mental activity going on. And when we're under anesthesia, when we're in dreamless sleep, there are times that there may be things going on. So even when we're under anesthesia, we're still breathing. Even when we're in dreamless sleep, our heart is still beating. And even when we're in dreamless sleep, as the mystics will tell us, there is a consciousness that is still there, but we're not aware of it. They call it the clear light consciousness. And of course the techniques of lucid dreaming are designed to help us to move into that experience. So that even while the body is asleep, even while the brain is shut down, there's a lucidity and awareness of consciousness. But in our society, consciousness itself tends to mean a mental activity, an awareness of a mental activity. There's something going on, we're aware that it's going on, and we're thinking about what's going on. But there's another level that unfolds when you start to kind of peel back this onion, when you start to get into it. And that level is an awareness without thought, an awareness without thought, a perception, a knowing, a being rather than a doing. So as we come into this, we're going to have to explore a little bit those ideas of what do we mean by consciousness, what do we mean by awareness, what do we mean maybe by alertness, what do we mean by being, what do we mean by being as opposed to doing. And then there's this whole concept of sin. Now we don't use the word sin much in our teaching because we don't understand it in the traditional sense. But traditional sense, I mean kind of the one that I grew up with in many people did in Sunday school. It was a transgression against God. It was a violation of some type of moral or ethical code. And it was something that was actually kept account of for later punishment. I had this vision when I was a little kid. I had this mental image that the soul was kind of like this blank slate, because we were told when we were baptized that there was an indelible mark put upon our souls, so that God would always know that we had been baptized. So I had this little vision of like this little blank slate, and it had this big mark at the top that said you had been baptized, and then there was all these other little marks along for every sin, every transgression. And at some point in time in the future, there was going to be an accounting for that. That was the idea of sin that I grew up with, and that was a child's idea. I'm not blaming the religion or the theology. What I'm saying is that was the concept that I held, and that's the concept that a lot of people hold. Dr. Holmes tells that there's no sin but a mistake. And of course, one of the definitions of sin, one of the older definitions, was it meant to miss the mark. It was a term that was used in archery. And when the archer let the arrow fly, if it missed the mark, that was a sin. You see something similar today in tennis. And in tennis, what you see is if on the serve, if they hit the ball and it hits the net and then it goes over the net and it falls within bounds, that's called a let, L-E-T, let. Not net, but let. It's a let ball. And the reason it's called let is one of the older definitions of let meant to hinder, to obstruct. And you'll see this in the Bible, no man can let no man can let, these kind of things. At times the word let in the Bible is referring to a hindrance. So sin kind of meant to miss the mark. It's a mistake that is made. And the traditional idea of sin that I was raised with as a child was there were different degrees. There were some sins that were more or less worse than others, There were some things that weren't so awful bad, but yet they were bad, maybe stealing a candy bar or telling a lie. And then there were other sins that were just terrible, like committing murder, things like that. So they had this idea of degrees. There was a degree of sin, or a degree of mistakes, if we want to think of them that way. Even to the point where we're told in the New Testament that there is one sin that is unforgivable, completely unforgivable. And that sin was referred to as a blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, And of course it raises all kinds of theological questions as to what that means. So I just bring that up because many people have that sort of a background. They have that sort of education as children, and we need to kind of go through that just a little bit as we move forward. So the ideas of sin being a mistake and sin being a transgression of some moral law, either way, if you take them, the understanding then that there are degrees of mistakes. If you take sin to be missing the mark or sin to be a mistake, there are degrees of mistakes, just like an archer might miss the center of the target by a little bit or by a whole lot. There are degrees of mistakes that we make. Some mistakes have, for lack of a better way of explaining it, some mistakes have greater consequences than others, You can make a mistake, for example, where you don't put gasoline in your car and you run out of gasoline and you have to call roadside assistance and they come out and they put gas in your car for you. Happens to all of us, not necessarily a big deal. You can also make a mistake where you forget to put your parking brake on and the car rolls down a hill and goes in a creek and floats away. The consequences of that are a little bit greater. But the idea of the mistakes for most of them is that they can be forgiven. They can be forgiven. They can be undone. Is a better way to explain it. And usually we have them undone with the help of somebody who's a little bit wiser than we are, with another person. So when you're learning something new, as an apprentice, for example, when you're learning something new, it's only natural to make mistakes. But if you're working with a master, I worked when I was a teenager. I worked with one of my uncles, and he was a great carpenter. He was just absolutely incredible. and what he could do with his hands and a couple of tools and the beautiful things he could make. And he would take me out to work with him when he was doing something. And he used to chuckle. He used to ask during the week, he'd say, "Now, you coming to work with me on Saturday?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And he'd say, "Okay." I said, "Well, oh." I said, "Why do you ask?" He says, "Well, when you're coming to work with me, I have to buy wider molding." And that was his little dig at me, because when I would cut a piece of drywall to put up in a corner, my edges were so rough that he needed a big wide piece of molding to put over there to cover them. My point is, he knew how to forgive that mistake. He knew how to cover up that mistake. He knew how to make it okay. So that we have these ideas that we can make mistakes, and with the help of other people, we can not only learn how to minimize the consequences or minimize the impact of the mistake, but after a while, we can learn how not to make that mistake. After a while, he would show me a better way to measure, a better way to cut, a better tool to use, for example, so that I got my edges straighter and could measure more precisely, and I could cut more precisely. Now we come to this idea of, well, but is there a mistake that no one else can fix for us? Is there a mistake that we are the only ones who are responsible, able to respond? We are the only ones who can undo that mistake. And that's what I think, we get into when we talk about this unforgivable sin or unpardonable sin. The Holy Spirit in the New Testament was the doer of the word. We might say the doer of the word is the law of mind. And if we do not acknowledge this power that responds to us according to our word, if we refuse to acknowledge that and we persist in our old way of thinking, nobody can help us. Nobody can help us. So I'm just kind of putting it out that is the way that I process all of that, and that is the way that I come to all of that. That there is a mistake. There is a mistake of unconsciousness. And we must move beyond that mistake of unconsciousness if we are to grow. And there are people who, once we make the decision, once we have taken the step that no one else can take for us, we have made the decision that we are going to awaken, there are others who can show us the way. There are others who can show us how to minimize the consequences of our old ways of thinking. And there are others who can kind of help us through the process of awakening. But you and I, each and every one of us, we must come to that realization on our own. We must desire, we must want to awaken on our own. And only then can other people really be helpful to us. Because up until that point, up until the point where we truly commit ourselves to our awakening, we can hear lots of words. We can read lots of books. We can sing lots of songs. We can go to lots of different retreats and walk on coals and all of those things. We can do all of those things, and they may be a part of our awakening. But if we are truly not ready to awaken from our human experience into our spiritual experience, those things really don't have the benefit, the spiritual benefit. So let's talk a little bit about consciousness and unconsciousness and the techniques. We're going to get into a couple techniques of awakening. In Buddhism, the term Buddha meant the awakened one. And in Buddhism, there's a concept that each and every one of us is a potential Buddha. We have the potential to awaken. In Christianity, we might think of the term as being born again in the realm of the spiritual. the spiritual person. Um, Sometimes the Bible talks about the new Adam and the old Adam. Now remember, Adam meant clay man, literally meant clay man in the language that was spoken at the time. Adam meant the human. Right? Remember, God supposedly took 100 pounds of clay and breathed life into it. The very life that is in our nostrils is the life of God. But the bodies that we use while we are here are nothing more than the dust of the earth. From dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. Kind of a thought. So the old Adam is the Adam who believes himself or herself to be human, to be only human. But the new Adam, the new concept of the self, is a spiritual concept, born again in spirit. So if you think about the human intellect, we talked about that a lot last month. If you think about the human intellect and the way that it works, it learns to do a lot of things, and then it kind of relegates those tasks down to a level of very, very limited conscious awareness. We learn to do things and we form a habit. Now we can understand that was a good thing as human life was evolving, and we had to learn to deal with new environments, new challenges to survival, new threats, all of those things. That we would learn to do something, and then we would kind of relegate it down to a level of almost automation, so that the powers of observation could then free themselves up to take in new information. It's kind of how we learn as human beings. Probably the great capacity that we have for learning is we can, if we choose, we can keep our minds open to learning it all the time. And it's interesting to me that the machines that we as human beings build, in many cases, mimic our own self-image, our own concept of the way we think. I've made my living since the late 1960s working on computers. And when I learned how to work on computers, back in the day when I learned how to work on computers, everything was simply zeros and ones. And we had to learn how to look at a string of either 8 or 16, depending upon the system we were working on. We had to be able to look at a string of either 8 or 16 zeros and ones put together. And we had to understand what that meant to the processing unit. What was the processing unit going to do when it received that string of information? So literally, part of my training was literally to build a small computer that worked one step at a time. Now computers, you hear today they talk about the clock speed of the computers as being like 4 gigahertz, 4 billion operations a second. We had to do it one operation at a time, so that we would learn how the computer worked. But then programming came along, a higher language programming. So rather than doing everything in coding in zeros and ones, the languages became more and more complex. And as they became more and more complex, things started to happen on an automated basis. The programmers would write a piece of code called a subroutine. So for example, a subroutine might be to determine the square root of a number. So anytime somebody was solving a mathematical problem or running another program that required a square root to be determined, they just simply called up that subroutine. So the computer would be running along and says, oh, I need the square root of a number, calls a subroutine, passes over the parameters, gets back the square root of the number, plugs it into its code, keeps on running. All of this operation is taking place in the background. All of this is going on. In those days, if you worked in a computer room, you just saw blinking lights. And we used to laugh that they were entertainment lights. They just kept strangers, when they came in to visit, they would see the lights flashing and think that something really important was going on. And basically there was a little program that said flash the lights so that the visitors will have something to look at. My point is that all of these things were being relegated down to a point where human consciousness did it one time, programmed it, and then after that it took place below a level of conscious awareness. So that allowed programmers to come in and start to think in higher order problems to solve. They no longer had to worry about how do you go in and determine the square root of a number. Somebody else had already done that. It worked. No need to think about it. So the machines that we build kind of mimic the way that our minds work. What has happened, if you think about things that you've learned through your life, you learned how to drive a car, and while you were learning how to drive a car, you were very aware of what was going on. You were very aware of whether the car was moving the way that you wanted it to move, or whether the car seemed to be moving as if it had a mind of its own. You know, you were very aware if you hit the brake and then suddenly the car screeched to a halt, or if you hit the brake and the car didn't stop quick enough. You were tuned in to all of these different aspects while you were learning them. But now 30 years later, you get in the car, you put your drink in the drink holder there, and you turn on the radio and turn on the AC, and you know now you hit your GPS and it tells you where to turn. You don't even have to put your attention to that. Think how much time we wasted when we were young trying to memorize directions to places. Don't even need to do that anymore, and we would go. So driving has become automatic. So if we stop and think about life in general, the life that we live to a very large degree is automatic. We are not consciously present. We're not consciously present with what we're doing. We're not consciously present with what we are. We start to do a task. Our minds call up that subroutine within us, that little part of us that already knows how to do that task. And while that automated part of us is doing the task, our minds are someplace else. Our intellect is someplace else. Maybe we're thinking about tomorrow. Maybe we're thinking about yesterday. Maybe we're thinking about something entirely unrelated. And the task gets done. The task gets done, but not with our conscious attention, or perhaps with a minimal conscious attention. This is why sometimes I'll finish doing something and 10 minutes later I'll have to go back and check to see if I'm done, because I don't remember completing it. I did it, maybe it wasn't me, but something did it. It was done. But I wasn't consciously aware of completing the task. Something simple, something that you do a zillion times a day. I come in the door when I've gone someplace. I come in the door and there's a row of hooks right by the door. So I come in, I hang my keys right there, because then I know where my keys will be. And I've got another place for my wallet and a different place for my phone. So it's kind of a little ritual. I come in and I do these things, and then I go do whatever the next thing I was going to do is. And sometimes later I say, did I put my keys on the hook? And I have to go to the hook and look to see if they're there. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We do it, but we do it without conscious awareness. So what happens to us, what happens as human beings, what this gets down to is we're not here. We're not present in the moment. And it makes you wonder, if I'm not here doing it, then who's doing it? Who is doing it and how is it getting done? And the way it's getting done and who is doing it is my old self. So over time I built up a way, a protocol, a way of doing these things over time that became ingrained in my subconscious. And now every time that task comes up, it gets done exactly the same way. Exactly the same way as it was done when I programmed myself to do it, albeit not consciously aware. Most of the day, most of the things that we go through in a day, most of the things that we hear in a day, we do it without being present, without being conscious, without being there. I was listening to something this morning speaking on this topic, and the author was talking about the First World War, and they said that while Europe was engaged in the First World War, the people in America wanted no part of it. The public sentiment was strongly against it. In fact, Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, and his slogan was, "He kept us out of war. He kept us out of war." Yet he was only a few months into his second term when we were in war. We were engaged in the war in Europe. And the American sentiment quickly swung from being totally against the war to supporting the war. And what the speaker was pointing out, was a tape I was listening to, and what the speaker was pointing out is that what had happened in that time was that there was a Committee for Public Information, a propaganda committee that was set up by Wilson, and it was their job to sway public opinion. And they did, and they were very effective, and they made films and they made movies showing the atrocity of war, of course showing the atrocity of war being committed by those people that we were going to fight. And the American people absorbed that, and it swayed their opinion, and it swayed their opinion very quickly. And then of course the question is, well, how much of what they were showing was actually true? And to them it really didn't matter, because their job was to sway public opinion. As a matter of fact, after the war, some of them were criticized for having gone too far and told outright lies in the great interest of swaying public opinion. But the point is that this happened at an unconscious level. People saw this information, they absorbed this information, and they didn't question this information to say, is that really so, or is that no so, or is this just propaganda that is designed to persuade me? Very quickly, the public opinion swayed. Similar thing happened during the Second World War. And once again, the Americans didn't want to intervene. And in 1939 at the World's Fair, the British government came over and they had a display, and their display was largely propaganda designed to create the sympathy of the American people. And once again, very quickly, especially with Pearl Harbor, very quickly, the sentiment of the people changed. Now we look back and say, well, that was then, but this is now. But but take a peek now at what's going on in our world, and look at the decision-making process that we see going on in our society. If you just look at social media and you look at all of the little memes that people are posting, I mean, it's just polarized. And some people are posting things that are for this position, and some people are posting things that are for that position, the opposite position. And if you look at your list of friends, you're going to find that some people always post things for this side and some people always post things for that side. And yet if you would step back and take a look at any one of those things that is posted and try to dig into it, you would find that neither one is telling the complete truth. They are all very blatantly telling one side of a story, and they are telling it for one purpose and one purpose only, to persuade. And what the propagandists, and now we call them public relations people, and Edward, I'm not making that up, Edward Bernays used to call it propaganda. He wrote a 1920 book called Propaganda. He's largely considered the father of public relations. He changed the term to public relations because he realized that propaganda was perceived in a bad light. But what they have come to learn is that people do not consciously process the information. That is, we hear something that agrees with something we already believe, a priori belief, something we already believe. We hear something that appears to be a fact that agrees with something we already believe, and we accept it as true and we share it. And we hear something that doesn't agree with that which we believe to be already true, and we reject it as false. And we don't ever go in there to do the homework to become consciously aware. The propagandists know this, and they know that it's effective. And I think what you're seeing now with the availability of social media is that any attempt to even, excuse me, any attempt to even appear to be telling you the truth is now gone. It's just blatantly tell your side of the story. And if you look at our court system, even our court system is designed that way. Court system is designed that two different sides come in, they blatantly tell their side of the story, and 12 reasonable people are supposed to be able to figure it out. And of course now you're finding out that there are experts who will tell you how to manipulate the jury, how to psychoanalyze the jurors, how to find out about them so that the attorneys can present the most convincing case. So it's not that 12 reasonable people can figure it out. These 12 reasonable people are being swayed at an unconscious level. What all of this means is that in our human experience, we as human beings in our human experience, we are not functioning to a great degree of awareness. We are functioning to a great degree like robots. We are functioning to a great degree like the computers that we have built, where everything is getting relegated off to subroutines. And yet, what we're using the free time that it has freed our conscious mind up for is to go flit off into the future or back to the past. And what we want to come to realize is that that may have been appropriate as part of the human experience, but now it is time to awaken. It is time to awaken. What that means is that while we are doing that, we are we are involved in the sin, the mistake of unconsciousness, because we are never going to find God. We are never going to find our spiritual nature by trying to live our human lives more efficiently, more effectively. We have to come to a point where we desire to awaken. In the story of the life of the Buddha, we're told that he reached the point where he sat under the tree and he said, I will sit here until either I achieve enlightenment or I will die. To him, at that point, the moral of the story is the commitment was there. He was determined to awaken. He was determined to break out of the experience of unconsciousness that the world is engaged in. And I think we have to remember that when we look at what's going on in the world, we have to understand that what is going on in the world is largely occurring out of unconsciousness, out of unconsciousness. So this is where mindfulness comes in. We learn mindfulness meditation. We learn about being here now. In Zen, there's a famous quote by a Zen teacher that says, I only know meditation, one meditation. I only know one meditation. I eat when I eat. I walk when I walk. And when I'm sleepy, I sleep. What he was saying is, be here now. Whatever it is that we are doing, can we be here now? Can we bring our full awareness to the moment? This is what meditation helps us to do. We start to meditate and we become aware of the fact that our mind has wandered off. Osho says our mind is like a dog, it's like a stray dog. The dog wanders and we follow it. We just follow it around town, going from place to place. When we learn how to meditate, we become aware. First step, we become aware. We become aware that our thought process is willy-nilly. Our thought process is monkey mind. Our thought process is the little grasshopper of the Kung Fu TV show. It flits from here to there to everywhere. And the reason that this is a mistake is that as long as we allow it to do that, we will never progress. We will never grow spiritually. We may have a better human life, We may have a more comfortable human life. But we must remember that this human life that we are so fond of living in comfort is just a passing experience. It is not who we are. It is not forever. It is something we come into, and it is something we leave. So where do we want to put our effort? Where do we want to put our energy? Do we want to put our energy into building better buildings that will someday fall down? Or do we want to put our energy into awakening the consciousness that persists forever? That's part of the process of awakening. That is the part of the process of coming out of the dream. I love what Joel Goldsmith tells us. He says that in the book of Genesis, we're told that God created Adam, and of course this is a mythology now. God created Adam, and Adam was lonesome, and he wanted a mate. So God put Adam into a deep sleep and removed his rib and created Eve. But the book of Genesis never tells us that Adam woke up from that dream. See, we are still stuck in the Adam dream. We are still stuck in the sin of unconsciousness. We are still stuck in the duality of believing in good and evil. We are still stuck in the idea of separation, that there's a God out there, but not down here. Our mind is still flitting to the past and to the future when everything that is required is here and now. And we have to awaken, and we have to desire to come into that moment. So a couple things that we can do as we go through this. One of the Buddhist teachers, his students would notice that every once in a while he would shout out his own name. And after he shouted out his own name, he would say, yes, I'm here. And, first they thought he was a bit odd, just going about his day, and then he would shout out his own name, shout out, yes, I'm here. So finally the students asked him, why did he do that? And what he did was, when he realized that his mind was wandering, when he realized that he wasn't fully present, when he wasn't eating while he was eating, when he wasn't walking while he was walking, when he wasn't fully present, he would call out his own name. Because there's something about hearing our name, excuse me, that gets our attention. Alan Cohn, in his book, Joy is My Compass, talks about a time where he worked in the medical tents at rock concerts. And they had to deal with a lot of people who were dealing with psychotic breaks. They had taken LSD and things like that, and they were, having a psychotic break. And what they tried to do was they tried to find that person's name. The medical personnel tried to find that person's name. And when they found that person's name, they would call them by name, because there was something about hearing their own name. Excuse me. There was something about hearing their own name that would start to bring them out of the fog. So this Buddhist teacher would shout out his own name as a way of bringing himself back from his wandering mind. And then he would say, yes, I'm here, I'm back, I'm here, I'm now. So if you find yourself during the day, you want to try to be aware of, where am I? Where is my mind? Am I here now? Am I eating while I'm eating? Or am I eating breakfast and thinking about what I'm going to do when I get to the office? Am I eating breakfast and reading the news or watching the news? Am I here now? And this is what mindfulness training is all about. Can I be here now? Another technique that you can use, and this is especially good for those who live in rural areas or down by the beach. I used to love to do this when we lived at Carolina Beach, and that was to drive down the end of the island, past Fort Fisher, past where the streetlights end, and just look up at the stars. Can you go somewhere where you can see the blackness of the night, the stillness of the night, and just be there in that moment without your mind wandering to tomorrow or going back and reflecting over today. If your mind starts to wander, call it back. Call your name if necessary. Call it back. Bring it back. Remember we talked last week about the shepherd with the crook and the staff to bring the little ones back. Bring your mind back. And here's the next part of it. So that's where we have to begin. We have to begin, first of all, we have to desire to wake up. No one can do that for you. I can't do it for you. No one can do it for you. Right? That is the unpardonable or unforgivable sin, is not wanting to wake up. And I only say that it's unforgivable or unpardonable because nobody else can help you with that. You know, it's not like the master carpenter can get a wider piece of molding to cover for you. No one else can do that for you. You have to do that yourself. You have to want to wake up. And then when you want to wake up, of course, part of it is catching yourself when you're running on autopilot. You've probably had the experience, I think we all have, if you've driven long enough and far enough that you're going down the interstate highway and you're going at 70 miles an hour or whatever the speed limit is. And all of a sudden you look up and say, wow, how did I get here? It's been 100 miles since I remember reading the last sign. Man, something was driving that car for 100 miles. You made it. But it's like you had slipped into some type of a subroutine, some type of an autopilot. We do that during our day every time that we are engaged in something and our mind is in the future or in the past. Or we're multitasking, which multitasking is kind of an illusion to me. The way computers work is they do one thing at a time and they stop when they're interrupted and then they do the next thing and then they go back to the first thing and they do it very quickly. At least the computers I worked on years ago. And some of them now have several processors that basically each processor does the same thing, but they do them all at the same time. But in the human experience, we kind of do that. We think we're multitasking, but we do something, we stop, we start doing another thing, we stop, we go back to the first thing. So we're constantly moving back and forth. And I've watched people in the work environment do this, and they're absolutely convinced that they do four things at the same time, and they do them quicker than if they did them one at a time until completion, and they don't. What happens is they're not aware of when they're stopping. They're not aware of when they're switching from one thing to another. So we want to catch ourselves, and we want to start with simple things, you know. Can I eat when I eat? Can I walk when I walk? When I'm driving, can I be there while I'm driving? Find something that appeals to you to practice with. Find something that you can be mindful of. And as we do that, I want to bring in the second part of this, is that as we do that, are you thinking? Are you thinking about this? Because the first part of the human experience is thinking. I think, therefore I am, was Descartes' statement, and other people say it's Descartes' error. So when we bring our awareness to it, are we thinking about it? Right? So we start out, we're thinking about the future, we're thinking about the past, we're thinking about everything else, and now I bring myself to my bowl of Rice Krispies. And I want to be here. I just want to be here. I want to experience them. You see, I don't want to think about them. I don't want to analyze them. I don't want to weigh them. I don't want to know how many calories there are in the bowl. I want to experience them. See, this is the being instead of the doing. So now that I can bring myself into the present and I can bring myself into conscious awareness of what's going on here, can I take that consciousness another step and take it beyond thought? So as we were talking last month, the intellect is the problem. The intellect is something to be transcended. Excuse me. Because while our mind is jumping from here to there to everywhere, we're not experiencing that which can only be known through experience and only can be known in the here and the now. Excuse me, I have to get a drink of water. So the first step is the desire. Excuse me, we have to want it. Second step is we have to consciously bring ourselves to it, call our name and bring ourselves back to it. Oh, my mind was wandering, I'm going to bring it back over here. Practice our meditation and then try to carry that technique back into the day. When we're doing something and our mind wanders away, my mind has wandered away. I am bringing it back. I am here now. And then the third step is, can we stop thinking about it? Can we just experience it? Now, you've heard the saying, did you stop and smell the roses, or are you analyzing their fragrance? Can we just be with it? Not think about it. Not analyze it. And the technique for this, to learn this, is no judgment. No judgment. The human mind spends a great deal of time trying to judge things and assign values to them. Try not doing that. Try not doing that. It just is. It just is. We were reading some Zen teachings on a Skype class a few years ago, and our friend Pete latched onto one that he used to remind the class of from time to time, and that is perhaps. When something comes up and we want to label it good or bad, instead just say perhaps. Perhaps. And the story we were studying was a Zen story about a man who had a mare, and the mare ran away. And the neighbors came and said, "Oh, you poor unfortunate fellow, your mare ran away, and now you don't have a horse to plow your fields. Isn't that terrible?" And the man said, "Perhaps, perhaps." And then the next day the mare came back, and the mare brought 3 or 4 wild stallions with her, brought them right back into the corral. And the men came to him and they said, the neighbors, they said, "Oh, aren't you lucky, man? Your mare came back and your mare brought you 3 or 4 more wild horses, and now you can tame those horses and you can sell them and you can make money. Aren't you a lucky fellow?" And he said, "Perhaps." Perhaps. Well, his son went out and tried to tame one of the horses, tried to saddle break it, and the horse threw him off and the boy broke his leg. And the neighbors came and said to him, "Oh, you poor unlucky fellow, your son was trying to tame the horse and he broke his leg. Isn't that unfortunate?" And he said, "Perhaps." And then a warlord came through, and the warlord was getting ready to go to war, and they were conscripting all of the young men of military age and forcing them into the army. But this man's son didn't have to go because he had a broken leg. And then the neighbors came and they said, "Aren't you lucky your son had a broken leg?" And of course the answer was, "Perhaps." So the non-judgment technique, when something comes up in our lives and we start to catch ourselves labeling it, analyzing it, judging it, the ain't it awfuls. And again, if you watch the news, the headlines of the news, the lead stories are designed to arouse anger or fear, or both, because the emotions of anger or fear keep us tuned to the channel, and that is exactly what they want. So when something starts to hook us, when something starts to reel us in with anger, with fear, with judgment, with outrage, with all of these human emotional buttons that the propagandists, the public relations people, the advertisers, they want to push. Call your name. Yes, I'm here. Perhaps. Perhaps. Perhaps the thing for us to consider is that we have lived long enough as human beings. We have come to the point where we have realized that there's a greater potential. We have realized that there's something else. And now it is time to start living that way. There's no merit or growth in going back and continuing to do things the same old way, over and over and over the same old way, just because they work, just because they're convenient, just because they make life comfortable. We want to be here now in every moment as spiritual beings, because in that moment we have the opportunity to create something different, something new, something totally unlike what we've experienced in the past. See, when we try to create using only our mind, all we do is kind of recombine things from the past, maybe put them all together in a slightly different way, but we're just drawing on our background, our education, our experience, and we're reassembling things. If I asked you to sit down and design a house, you would sit down and design a house. Probably it would have many of the features of the houses that you liked. It wouldn't be something totally, completely different. But when we get in touch with our spiritual nature, when we get in touch with the essence of being, that's when the possibility of something totally different comes through. The thing totally different that we want to come through is the actual experience, the realization by experience that we are not human beings, but that we are spiritual beings. And we will never do that as long as we remain unconscious. So we want to break out of the cycle. We want to break out of the habit. We want to break out of the mistake of unconsciousness. We have a couple techniques to do it. We can call our name. We can go sit in the night sky, and we can lose ourselves in the vastness, and we can stop judging. 3 techniques to take away and to practice. We can bring ourselves into conscious awareness with thought and be in the moment now with thought. And after we've done that, we can learn to be in the moment without thought, to just be into the experience. See, God is not an intellectual problem to solve. God is not something to know about. Our spiritual nature is not something that we will discover by a mathematical formula. It is not something just to read about or to hear about or to sing about, but it is something to experience. The only place and the only time that we can experience our soul is here and is now. So I invite you this week to make a deliberate effort to pinch yourself awake, to poke yourself to see if you're asleep, to bring yourself into the conscious awareness of the moment, first with thought, and then without thought. And then you will be awakening from the sin of unconsciousness. And so it is.